7 o'clock.
Good.
Thank you all for coming out for the September B Club meeting. Things are starting to pick up for the club in terms of events coming up. We've got this Saturday, the annual pancake breakfast that happens out in Arivaca. This year in the past, it's been a thing where we, to take part in the breakfast, you had to make a donation, but this year, because we've always had such good turnout, and the town of Arivaca has always been a great supporter of the event, this year we're doing it free of charge, and so you don't have to pay anything to attend or eat at the pancake breakfast. There will be the option to give donations if you'd like to. We're going to have 3 different talks going on at 9 a.m., 10 a.m., and 11 a.m. They're not really if you're a beekeeper, they're not very bee specific. They're more like general public, how to take care of bees and understand what's going on with bees in Tucson and Southern Arizona. And then we will be having a raffle of some things that have been donated by club members. We've had some, community members and club members donate some cool stuff, but we are still looking for more donations for the raffle to help the club make some money. If you've got anything in mind that you'd like to donate, reach out to Monica or myself to do that. We do need if anyone's willing to volunteer to help out, if you plan on attending. Anyways, it would be nice if you could help just with organization and taking care of the event and stuff like that. So reach out to Monica. She's kind of organizing that at this point if you are going to attend and are willing to volunteer to help out. Where is it? So where in Arivaca is it at this year? It's in a new location.
Community Center.
The community, okay, so it's at the Arivaca Community Center, which is different than from years past, if you've gone in years past. So anyways, I hope to see you all out. It should be a beautiful day out in Arivaca, so come out if you can make it. And again, all the donation, anything that's made at that event will go into the club, will all be donated to the club. And so it's Christine Stockwell and Monica, she's really the one that came up with the idea and puts it on every year. So it's really her event, and so it's awesome that she does that. So just know that that's going on. We've got other news. We've got we just secured Tom Seeley to speak for the November meeting. Tom Seeley is a big author in the bee world. He is a very sought after speaker. So it was kind of exciting that we were able to get him to talk to us, and he's got a list of different topics that he gives talks about, and one of them happens to be about water foraging and water usage in the hive, and we decided that would be a cool, appropriate topic, given that we're here in Tucson where there's a lot of issues related to bee water foraging and water usage. So he's going to be talking at the November meeting about colony water usage, and I'm looking forward to that. He's definitely a big figure in the beekeeping world, and it's cool that he's going to be talking to our club. So another thing, we are going to be having a booth at the Organic Gardeners Club event, which will be happening in late October. We'll be looking for volunteers for that as well. We usually sell honey and beeswax and anything that the club members have that they want to sell. It's on a consignment basis, so if you have anything that you want to sell, basically the club, you tell us what you would like to sell to the club at, we mark it up a percentage and then sell it to the public, and then so that's a way that if you're a club member and you have some bee related stuff that you want to sell, you can do it that way. And that also helps the club make a little bit of money as well. We have an observation beehive that we put out for that, and so we get a lot of interaction with the public, just because they are, find it interesting to come look at the observation hive and spot the queen and do all that. So if you're willing to come out and talk to people about bees and participate in that, that'll be going on in late October. So that's all the big events and news that I can think of off the top of my head. So anyways, yeah, and then in December we'll have our potluck that we normally have. So look forward to that as well. Yeah, I think that's all of the business related stuff, I guess, to start with. So yeah, then the next thing would be the state of the hive. So right now we are getting towards fall, and you need to be, looking towards the winter with your hive management right now. You need to be making sure that your colonies are prepared to enter the winter and to slow down for the year. And I'm really, hives that had not been treated for mites or had not had their mites taken care of, those problems are really manifesting in a big way this time of year. So, it's a kind of thing that those problems are going to really rear their head and go, get bad quickly if you don't start, if you haven't dealt with your mite problems and, aren't currently. So I'd say if you still need mite treatments, this month is the time, you're getting to the last kind of part of the year where it's appropriate to treat here. So, so think about doing that. There are parts of, depending on what part of town you're in, there are dearths. I've had robbing going on in my house in Midtown when I bring honey supers in from the farm for a while now. So these in Midtown Tucson, I know have been struggling. Yeah, depending on if there's areas where there's been a little bit of monsoon, some areas bees are still bringing in pollen, but it seems like most bees are hurting for nectar right now. So start considering feeding sugar water to build up the weight for your hives for the winter, if you haven't done that already. Yeah, that's about all I can think of. Any questions or any other observations related to hives this time of year right now? Anybody?
If they need queens, they need to try to find them right now. Otherwise, there's no queens left for the rest until late spring.
Yeah, queens are getting, a lot of queen producers are now shutting down and selling the last of their queens for the year. My preferred queen producer sold out for the year. So yeah, we're starting to get to that time of year where if you need queens, it's getting harder and harder to find them. It's not a bad time to check your queen. If you've treated for mites and you're feeding your colony, if you're giving your colony everything it needs to be healthy and you're still seeing bad brood patterns in your hive, consider killing and replacing that queen. If the queen has no excuse to be giving a bad pattern because you've taken her everything else and she's still giving you a bad pattern, it's good to replace those queens while you can, because that'll help them get through winter and really get going next spring, rather than trying to nurse along a colony that's got a subpar queen. So that's another thing to consider doing right now. And then usurpation swarms is another one that just kind of hit me. Is this time of year and for the next 2 months really, usurpation swarms are a thing that happens in our area, which is where colonies that are that are swarming, they're either abandoning a hive because there was a bad mite infestation or they were starving, or oftentimes they're abandoning a colony because things weren't going well, and they're looking to, rather than establish a new colony like a swarm would, they're looking to take over an already established hive, take out the old queen and put their queen in its place, because this time of year it's late for them to try and build a hive from scratch. So these feral colonies seem to have found this behavior where they, go in and raid another colony, and you'll often, if you go into your bee yard, you might find a swarm of bees literally hanging on the side of one of your beehives, and fighting going on at the entrance of the hive, and so that's a usurpation swarm. So this time of year, you're kind of lucky if you happen to walk in your bee yard as it's happening. Most of the time, it's going to happen while you're not there, but just be aware that a new queen could basically be hostily installed in your hive while you're not there. And so when you're doing your inspections, make sure you're looking for marks on your queens if you've got marked queens, or just be aware of the fact that if your hive's attitude changes, it's possible that is due to the fact that it was usurped and you've now got a feral queen in there rather than your queen. So that's another thing that can happen this time of year. Not a lot of other parts of the country have that, where we have Africanized bees, that's an Africanized bee trait. So that's, you're not going to hear from many sources about that in other parts of the country, but here it's something that happens. Yeah, I think that's it for the state of the hive related stuff. Yeah. Okay, cool. So we'll get started on our talk for the day, which is all about beeswax. So we talked about honey. I forget if it was a month or 2 months ago, but you know, likely if you made a honey crop this year, you've harvested your honey and you're now left with beeswax, or you know, if you're cleaning up bird comb out of your hives this time of year, cleaning your hives up in preparation for winter, you're going to have beeswax lying around. So this is a talk about what to do, how to process that beeswax, and also how to produce beeswax in hives. So I'll just, you know, kind of let you know, give you as much as I can about beeswax. So yeah, go ahead. Okay. Thanks. Cool. So what is beeswax and where does it come from? Beeswax is a fatty secretion from the glands of workers. It's a fatty secretion from the glands of worker bees. This is an awesome picture that Monica provided. She took, and so what you can see here are these like flakes or fins of beeswax that are being secreted from between the seams of the bee's exoskeleton. So on the bottom side of their abdomen, between the seams of their exoskeleton is where they excrete the wax like that. And so this is pretty impressive. She literally got a flake of wax coming out of almost every gap on the bottom side of her thorax. That's a lot of wax for one bee to be producing. So that's a really cool picture. But yeah, oftentimes, you know, and it's typically younger to middle-aged bees that produce wax. So you know, that's in the spring is when you're most likely to see this. But at any point, if your colonies are in the flow, if you look closely, you'll find bees. You know, you might be able to find bees with wax secretions like that. And then the bees collect those secretions off of their body and build it into the combs that you see inside the hive. Chemical components of beeswax vary across bee species. So many different bee species produce wax secretions, and chemically they vary across different species. But all honeybees in Arizona and honeybees in New York State and honeybees in Europe all produce beeswax that is very, very similarly chemically, composed, basically. So obviously, honey produced in different regions is going to have chemical variations, but beeswax seems to be pretty universal when produced by bees of the same species. So European honeybees or Apis mellifera, what we have in that all of us keep is they will form beeswax and reform beeswax. So if a comb is damaged or ripped or uncapped, they will reform the comb, but they will build it into two different size cells. So you can see here the larger cells are like drone cells, and the smaller cells over here are worker cells. So typically, your European honeybees produce just two different sizes of cells, but then those cells can be used to store pollen or bee bread, nectar, honey, and to rear brood. So they have, these wax cells are really the structure of the colony and where the colony stores its food and rears its baby bees and everything. So the wax is a really critical part of the superorganism of the colony. So how to get bees to draw comb on a frame. So if you're trying to get bees to produce more comb, which is a big problem, is if you're starting or if you're trying to grow the number of hives you have, you're going to need more comb than you're going to start with, and so you're going to have to get bees to draw comb. So honeybees will build comb to fill any open spaces in their hive. If you put too few frames in, or if you forget to put a frame back, bees will fill those spaces with comb. So any space that's available, they will fill, and so you want to only provide them spaces where you want them to build comb and structures that you want them to build it in. So that's an important part of managing, for comb production. It can be tricky to get bees to build comb properly. You're trying to get, a whole bunch of bees to do, construct exactly how you want them to construct, and they may have other ideas. So just tricking bees into doing what you want them to do rather than what they want to do can be a little difficult when it comes to comb production. A lack of drawn comb will limit hive growth and honey production. So you will produce less honey if you've got a hive that's having to try and store honey in a box of foundation, as opposed to having a box of already drawn out comb that's ready to go and be filled immediately. It doesn't have to be constructed first. And then also if you're to buy a package or a nuke and you're able to give it additional drawn frames, that package or nuke will grow a lot more quickly if it's got pre-drawn cone that it can utilize immediately. So yeah, it really can be a limiting agent and can also be a huge accelerant of colony development if you do have drawn cone around to use. So bees that are fed, that are well fed or in a honey flow will build comb more quickly than bees that are, bees in a dearth really won't produce much or any comb. So you have to make sure your bees are well nourished and well fed, either because there's a honey flow on or because you're feeding them. And then again, I kind of mentioned in middle to young bees are the ones that produce most of the comb. So a colony with a large population of young bees is going to be well suited to, if you've got a colony that just had 10 frames of brood over the last 2 weeks, all those frames of brood hatched out, you've got a population in that colony that's just the right age to produce a lot of wax if everything is favorable. So all of those are good things to do if you want wax. And then frames with well-waxed foundation will be drawn out better than dry foundation for whatever reason. If there's already a nice layer of beeswax on it, the bees will react to it and tend to work with it more so than if you just put a dry foundation in. Checkerboarded frames usually get drawn out faster. So by checkerboarded, I just mean you intersperse a drawn frame with an undrawn frame, and then another drawn frame, and then another undrawn frame. So just by placing undrawn frames between two drawn frames, the bees will usually again interact with and draw those frames out quicker as well. So yeah, it's checkerboarding frames into a honey super or even into a brood area during the right times of year can get comb drawn out really quickly. Make sure undrawn frames are placed tightly together rather than spaced out. So when you've got a bunch of undrawn frames in a box together, make sure that they sit edge to edge with each other. Don't gap them out from one another, because if you put them edge to edge, there will be the right amount of space between the frames, and the bees will hopefully, no guarantee, but they're more likely to draw those foundations out appropriately. Where if you put gaps between your undrawn frames, the bees are more likely to interpret that space between the two frames differently and maybe try and draw a cross comb or just draw a sheet of comb out off of the foundation rather than using the foundation as the base. So make sure that your foundation frames are pushed all tight together so that the appropriate bee space exists between them so that they get drawn out right. Again, if you kind of go back, this is the kind of stuff that you can end up if you have too large of a gap between two of your frames. Even, sometimes bees will do this even if you do everything right, but this is the kind of stuff you're trying to avoid here, are bees that are building these combs, off of the foundation, not in the way that you want them. So anyways, yeah, that's what you're trying to avoid. And again, by putting them close, foundation frames edge to edge with one another, you can hopefully avoid that. So yeah, make sure frames are placed together. Feed thin. So I have found that feeding thin syrup, so 1-to-1 or thinner than 1-to-1 syrup, seems to encourage hives to draw comb out. I think because the bees need to take that thin syrup and dry it down, so they've got a lot of volume of liquid and they have to store it somewhere. And they're also being nourished by the feed that you're giving them and the sugar in it. So between the additional carbohydrates and also having all this liquid that needs to be dried out and cured, the bees are really kind of motivated to build up comb so that they can store that thin syrup and dry it out. So I don't know if textbooks agree with that, but I know that I've had that experience in the fall when I'm trying to get comb drawn out. I throw a bunch of thin feed at them, and it seems to work. So, and then again, if you're starting a package or a nuke, it's recommended to feed continuously until your bees have drawn out at least one whole brood box. This again because your colony is going to be limited in its growth and its storage capacity if it doesn't have a lot of comb. So early on, it's really good to try and encourage a package or a nuke to build as much comb as rapidly as it can, because that will help them get going and not be limited by how much storage space they have, basically. So moving on to the properties of beeswax, these are some things that are either unique to beeswax or important to beeswax for its processing and for its many uses that it has. So it is plastic at room temperature. It can be molded and formed and bent and manipulated at room temperature. Some other waxes are much more brittle or are more likely to break and snap and crumble rather than rather than be malleable the way beeswax can at room temperature. Beeswax has a pretty low melting point of around 145, 150 degrees. So that's a very, reasonable to handle in terms of rendering and stuff like that. Beeswax begins to discolor if heated above 185 degrees Fahrenheit. It will just start to darken a little, basically. It's still beeswax and it can still be used for many things, but it just loses a little bit of its marketability. People tend to like very white or very yellow beeswax as it tends to take on a more brown color. It kind of isn't seen as valuable or as marketable. So beeswax is flammable. If you've ever tried to burn old frames that are no good anymore but have beeswax in them, you'll find that they burn incredibly well when they've got a bunch of beeswax on them. So yeah, if anything, or if you've got paper towels with beeswax from cleaning up rendering and stuff like that, that stuff all burns very well. So that is good for making candles and things like that, but it can be very dangerous during the rendering process. And it's just, it's just once beeswax gets burning, it goes. And then beeswax is quite inert to many substances. It doesn't interact with the atmosphere or water particularly, so it's very used for protecting surfaces and things. It can be used to coat things like apples that are in grocery stores. It's used to protect wood and things like that. So the fact that it doesn't interact with a lot of things means that if you coat stuff with it, it does a good job of protecting things. So it's a good protectant now. So history of use of beeswax. So beeswax has been used to make candles since ancient Egypt, as long ago as 300 BC. We have, concrete evidence of candles being used that far back. It's almost certain that people have been using beeswax for, many purposes longer than that, but we have concrete evidence going back that far. And again, candles at that point, for most of history, candles were made of either wax or tallow, with wax far being preferred. Tallow candles smell, they stink, they're smoky, and so beeswax candles are a much more pleasant way to light an indoor space than tallow candles are. So, so beeswax was the far preferred source, basically, for most of human history. And then beeswax has had many uses, including medicine, cosmetics, metal casting, waterproofing, and as an adhesive, including a lot of other applications, but that's just, again, beeswax has been used in incendiary devices before, in medieval warfare and things like that, so because of how flammable it is, and I mean, it was one of the only available natural waxes for a very long time, so any things that fats and waxes are useful for, beeswax was a go-to for a lot of human history. And then basically in 1830, I believe it was, some scientists figured out how to extract wax from petroleum, and that's where we get paraffin wax from. And so up until that point, beeswax was the thing, and there wasn't a lot of competition. But as of 1830 and the development of petroleum waxes, those are much more affordable. So a lot of applications in which beeswax used to be used, paraffin wax is now used instead because it's cheaper. And if you don't need some of the rather specific qualities of beeswax that paraffin wax doesn't share, it's cheaper to use paraffin wax. So, and then vegetable waxes as well. So vegetable waxes and petroleum waxes are really kind of modern solutions that have competed with and made beeswax obsolete in some settings. So anyways, now getting to how do you as a beekeeper take, how do you get wax and what do you do with it once you have it? So one of the main ways that you will get wax out of your hives is through honey cappings. So when you have honey and you're harvesting honey, the bees seal over the cells of honey with wax cappings, and you have to cut off or scrape off those wax cappings before you can spin the honey out of the frames. So you end up with a whole bunch of basically kind of a wax and honey mixture. This stuff is pretty chopped up because it's been through a capping spinner, which is like a big spinning tub that's got blades in it, and so that spins, gets all the last bits of honey out of your cappings. But yeah, this is basically what a bunch of cappings looks like after you've run them through a spinner. So that's one great resource for getting wax, and it's also it's basically cosmetic grade or food grade wax. It's basically as edible as the honey that you're producing is. It came right off of honey frames, so it's very high quality, very pure wax typically. Comes from cappings. And then burr comb is another big source of it. So again, burr comb is kind of a term we give to any place that bees build comb that we don't want. So if bees build comb in an out of place spot, we consider that burr comb. And what you want to do is anytime you go through and you're doing an inspection and you see bees building burr comb, some people, especially early beekeepers, are like hesitant because their bees aren't building a lot of comb, and then they start building comb like this, and they think, all that work that those bees did, I'm just going to destroy it by scraping it off. But it's better to do that because if you leave it alone, these bees are going to continue building these combs in fashions that you don't like, and they're going to put even more work into it, and then at some point it's going to be a big mess that you have to take care of. So as soon as you see bees doing this, and building comb where you don't want it, immediately cut it out with your hive tool and save it. The more you can, just nip it in the bud so that they don't continue to put more and more effort and more wax into building stuff that's eventually going to be unwanted anyways. So oftentimes when you go out to do your inspections, it's nice to have an extra bucket or some kind of container with you. So if your lids have wax on them, or if if your frames have wax on them like this, you can just scrape it off and throw it into a bucket and then carry it inside with you when you're done. So, and then kind of in addition to this, I didn't make a separate category, but if you do bee removals, any comb that you get out of a bee removal can be treated similarly to burr comb. I guess in a way you could call it all burr comb because it was built somewhere where it's not wanted. But yeah, so removal comb can be another big source of wax if you do cutouts. But anyways, yeah, those are kind of your main sources of beeswax as a beekeeper. And so the next step, once you've got a bunch of burr comb or a bunch of cappings, or both, you can combine both together to render. So once you have a bunch of wax that needs to be rendered, and you're able to separate the honey from the wax and any pupil casings or any other debris that might be in that wax. This wax, especially the darker stuff, there's pupil casings and stuff in this, so it's not all pure beeswax. And so by rendering, you're going to be able to melt it down and separate everything out of it. So again, by rendering beeswax, you're going to be applying heat to it, and beeswax is very flammable. So this can be, if it goes sideways, you could start a fire and have a problem. It's typically the flash point of beeswax is pretty high. It's almost 400 degrees Fahrenheit, and most of the rendering you're going to be doing is around the 150 to 180 degree temperature range. So things are going to have to, you're going to have to get way too hot to hit the flash point of beeswax, but it's something that you very much want to avoid doing at any point. So just a warning, if you're going to render beeswax, do it cautiously, especially avoid overheating to the flash point or just around open flames are the two ways that wax rendering can be a bit concerning. So these are kind of the three different, I'll explain to you the three different methods that I've used over my years, and I'm going to kind of explain, there are three of them, and I'm going to go through them in order of how much, the quantity of cappings that are able to be processed with each of these methods. So if you've not got a lot of cappings, if you're kind of doing a small render, I think the oven method is really nice. You set your oven around 160 to 180 degrees Fahrenheit. I set mine at 180 just because it seems to melt everything a little faster. If I set it down to 160, stuff seems to kind of sit in there and not melt as quickly. What I do is I just buy an aluminum turkey pan from whatever store, and then I put a queen excluder over the top of it, and then I put cheesecloth over the top of the queen excluder, and then I just pile all my cappings up on top of the cheesecloth, and I leave it in the oven for about 3 hours. And so what will happen is all this stuff on top will melt, and the honey and wax will drip through, and most of the stuff that, you know, pupil casings and whatever else was in the wax that you don't want will remain up on the cheesecloth. So after 3 hours, you pull this whole thing out of the oven, let it cool down, and down here in your pan, you should have a layer of melter honey and then a layer of wax. And melter honey is just honey that's been heated to the point where it's kind of been discolored and its flavor is different. People still, they'll refer to it as melter honey or baker's honey. People will use it for baking and brewing and barbecue sauces and things like that, so it's not a complete waste, but it's no longer like high quality table grade honey once it's been through the rendering process like this. But even with, you know, I use a capping spinner to spin honey out of my cappings, but it's never, you never get all of the honey out. You're always going to end up with some amount of honey melting through when you do a render like this, if you use wax, if you use honey cappings. So anyways, this is not, you know, if you are just dealing with a fairly small amount of stuff that you can pile up on top of a clean excluder on a pan like that, that's a nice way to do it. If you've got an oven and a clean excluder, you can bring, you know, you don't even need the cheesecloth, you can just use a clean excluder, and it will, you know, you're going to end up with a little bit more particulate in your wax, but it will still do a decent job of straining. So this is pretty low tech, you know, you don't need much to make that happen. Then the next step up would be the stock pot method, where you get a large, you know, 7 to 10 gallon stock pot, put it on your stove, fill it about a third of the way up with water, and then heat up the water in the stock pot on your stove. Again, you want it at about 150 to 175. Do not boil the water or overheat, and then you start adding your cappings and your burr comb to the warm water and wait for it all to completely melt. So you've got a big soup that is wax and water and cappings and everything, and then you just take that, take the stock pot off the stove, pour it through a strainer into a bucket, and let it cool, and you'll end up with a, you know, one layer on top that will be wax and one layer below that will be a mixture of honey and water. So kind of the downside to this is you don't get melter honey out of this because the melter honey gets mixed in with the water. So it doesn't, you don't get to keep the melter honey, but again, you can do a significant amount more wax in a single go with this than you can with the oven method. So this can be a pretty good method. The big concerns here are you have an open flame on your stove below your stock pot, and you're dealing with beeswax, so that can be a concern. If it boils over, it's a water wax mixture, but it's still, you know, letting beeswax get near an open flame is potentially a safety hazard. The other safety hazard is that you're going to have to take a large stock pot full of hot liquid, and you're going to have to dump it through a strainer. So just handling the large stock pot full of hot wax and water is also something to be, you know, take into consideration. So that's the stock pot method, and then I have now kind of outgrown both of those methods, and I use what's the melting tank method, which is they make wax melting tanks. And I have this exact tank, it's a 30-gallon tank, and it's water jacketed, and so you're basically able to, there's an outer water layer and an inner layer that holds, you know, all your wax cappings, and you're able to heat this. I set mine to about 165 degrees, I'll fill it up with 30 gallons of cappings. And then let it sit for about 24 hours at 165 degrees, and after 24 hours it has melted into 2 separate layers. And then I put a bucket below it and open the valve here, and the first thing that comes out is a bunch of melter honey. I usually, when I fill this thing up, I usually get about 5 to 7 gallons of melter honey out of it. And then once the melter honey comes through, you get a layer of kind of stuff that needs to be filtered out, kind of like a detritus layer, and then once you get through the detritus layer, you'll get pure, clean beeswax coming out. It's the last thing you get coming out. So that's what I get when I'm doing renders. I've got big pans, and so that's how I get these like sheets of beeswax like this. And I have some that are much thicker than this as well, but that's you know, this is kind of what directly comes out of a melter like that. And you know, you build this kind of a detritus layer on the bottom side, but it's actually pretty clean wax right out, you know, right from the get-go out of a thing like that. So they make 15-gallon versions of this, and I think Maxon makes like a 5 or 6 gallon version of this. So these can be useful. You know, there are smaller scale versions of this if you don't want to hold 30-gallon one of these things. But I have found this to be, pretty nice. You know, it's obviously only a solution if you are at the scale to need it, but a melting tank is kind of the commercial solution for rendering beeswax, so, yeah.
You have a solar version?
I did, yeah, that's a good point, I should have brought that up. Yeah, a solar oven, well, you don't need to be very good at making a solar oven in Tucson. You basically just need something with a piece of painted glass over the top of it, and you can mount beeswax. I've actually done it with, just 2 bee boxes. There's at Home Depot, they sell a pane of glass that is 20 inches long by 16 inches wide, which is almost exactly the same dimensions as the top of a bee box. So you can buy a single pane of glass and it will literally sit right over the top of a deep box as like a lid. So what I've done is just taken like a pan, an aluminum pan like the one you saw in the oven picture, set that on the ground, put a deep box over the top of it, put a queen excluder, put another deep box on top of that, loaded all my wax on top of the queen excluder over the top of the pan, and then you just set your glass on top of that. So you basically have got 2 deep boxes stacked on top of each other with an excluder in the middle and all your wax above it, and then your glass on top, and that can be used as like a solar oven, you know, and any day from March till October, you can, you know, put it outside and it will work here in Tucson. In some parts of the country, you actually need a very well-made solar oven, and then you have to bring it out on warm days to melt beeswax. But in Tucson, you really, yeah, a pretty primitive solar oven. I've seen people use coolers, just like a foam cooler you buy at the store, and put a painted glass over the top of it. But
I use sliding glass doors and a custom-made box.
okay, yeah, there you go. Sliding, yeah, that's nice. So you can just open it and close it.
Well, it's, you know, sliding glass door is huge.
Oh yeah.
So, you know, you just slide it off and then pull it back on when you.
Okay, yeah, so yeah, you can find an old window laying around or something like that, you can make a solar oven, so yeah, that's another method. I don't know why I didn't think of that, but yeah, solar oven is a great solution for rendering beeswax as well. Similar thing, just place all your stuff above a strainer, apply heat, and leave it alone until all the wax and honey pass through the strainer, and then cool it down, and it'll separate into 2 layers, so it's, yeah.
Is that what electric?
This is, yes, yeah, so it's got an immersion heater that's on the side of it, that goes in and warms the water that's around the outside of the tank. And this is the bottling tanks are the same way, built the same way, they just have a different valve on them, basically, but it's, you know, and for a honey melting tank, you'll heat it to 165. For a bottling tank, I usually have mine at like 95 degrees. So yeah, but it's just nicer to bottle honey when it's warm and runs quickly too, so yeah. So now that you've got your wax rendered using one of those 3 or 4 methods, if you include the solar oven, so you've now got beeswax, what do you do with it? So how to use beeswax for beekeeping. So what do you know, some people want to take that beeswax and return it back to their beekeeping operation. So there are several different ways that you can use that beeswax to benefit your bees. One of them is to wax plastic foundation. As you remember earlier when I was talking about drying comb, bees respond better to waxed foundation rather than dry foundation. Sometimes if you buy stuff out of a catalog or off Amazon, it may not come with a good enough layer of wax on it, and it can help to apply your own layer of wax. So again, for best acceptance and likely of drying out straight rather than honeycomb, a good layer of wax on foundation is good. You can cold rub wax onto foundation, just like a crayon, just like, you know, color it onto a foundation with a crayon. That's kind of, you have to apply a fair amount of pressure, and so it takes a bit of work to do that. But it can be done, you know, if you're only trying to wax 4 or 5 frames and you've got a little bar of wax, you can do it quickly that way. But the kind of preferred method is to apply the wax hot, so you can melt down, you know, take a, you know, measuring cup or something like that, throw it in your oven at 185 degrees with a bunch of beeswax in it. It'll melt down to a liquid, and then you can take a paintbrush and just paint that melted beeswax onto your foundation to coat your foundations with wax. And then your bees will be a lot more likely to use your foundations when you have wax on them like that. So I use that particular method, like if I have frames that have wax moth damage, and I have to scrape all the comb and everything back off of the frames, just get them back down to foundation. to get the wax moth damage off of them, I will paint a layer of beeswax onto those, like, you know, cleaned up foundations before putting them back into hives to get bees to reuse them. So that's the main, you know, if I get dry, I tend to try and buy foundation that has wax, that's well waxed. But you know, anytime you're salvaging old equipment that's had wax moth damage, it's going to be pretty dry. And if you put some wax on it, bees will really reuse it. So that's my main application of this particular thing. But I know a lot of people that bought beekeeping equipment off of Amazon this year were having trouble getting bees to draw out the frames. And some people figured out that it was because they really skimped on the wax or used some weird wax or something. But people found that once they added some beeswax to those frames, they were able to get them work. So yeah. So you can make beeswax foundations. So rather than buying plastic foundations, or you can buy pure beeswax foundations from beekeeping supply places. If you've got enough beeswax and the motivation to do it, you can actually produce your own foundation. They make rollers like this. So if you could see close up, these on either side of this roller is embossed a hexagonal pattern of the right size for foundation. So you basically take sheets of, you have to make first thin sheets of wax and then you run them through a roller like this, and it thins them out and puts that hexagonal pattern into them, and then you can use those as foundation for your hives. Or I've never used either of these things, to be honest, but there now seems to be either silicone molds or press molds like this, where you're able to take melted wax, pour it into a silicone mold, and put a top on it, and then after it cools down, you're able to take a sheet of foundation out, or there, you know, molds like this that are almost like a book that close, you know, like have a hinge on one side and close shut, and make wax foundation. So if you're kind of focused on, you know, self-sustaining beekeeping or very purity-focused beekeeping, this would be a good thing, because when you buy wax frames from the store, you don't know the source of that wax, whether that was very dirty bottom of the barrel wax that they purchased that might have pesticide residues in it or whatever, or if you buy beeswax foundation, again, you just don't know the source of that wax and how pure it is, where if you're using your own harvested and rendered wax to make your own foundation, you can be very certain of what's going into your hives. So it is very labor intensive to make your own foundation, but for people who are really, you know, want to focus on self-sustaining and really not letting anything into their hive that's, you know, that they don't want, this is a practice that can be attractive for that. And then wax dipping hive boxes. So this is typically something done by larger scale beekeepers, but for preserving bee boxes, and again, our environment doesn't necessarily demand, you know, we don't have boxes rotting in 5 years like in some parts of the country where it's hard to keep boxes from degrading. So, but in a lot of places they will wax dip their boxes to preserve them. But you need a big tank that can hold a lot of melted wax and is deep enough to submerge an entire box into. And even most commercial beekeepers, even though they produce a lot of beeswax, will oftentimes purchase paraffin wax and mix paraffin wax with their beeswax for doing this. Because paraffin wax is cheaper, and if you can sell some of your beeswax at a higher price and then buy paraffin wax to dip your boxes with, you'll do that. So many beekeepers will do a mix of paraffin and beeswax, but dipping your equipment in beeswax is a well-liked way to preserve it, basically. So that's another option. So, and then we move to what do you do with rendered wax that is not beekeeping, basically. So what are some things you can do with your beeswax? One very common one is to make candles. You can very traditional, simple, low-tech candles just by dipping. You just get some wicks and you just dip, you melt some wax into any kind of container. You just dip the wicks over and over again into the container, and wax will build. Every time you dip the candle down in, wax will build up over the wick, and the more times you dip them, the thicker the candles will get. So you can make very thin or very thick candles, really kind of custom depending on how many times you dip them. You can dip 1 or 2 candles at a time, or you can use a bar like this and hang wicks over the top of the bar, and you can make a whole lot of candles at one time if you want to get clever and efficient about it. So yeah, you can just make some really nice handmade candles that way. Very low tech solution to do that. You can also buy like silicone molds. Most beekeeping man lake has an entire selection of different candle molds. And so there's a little pinhole at the bottom of the mold, and you kind of use a pin to push a wick through the hole, and so you feed a wick through that hole, and then once you've got your wick pulled through the hole and set, you just pour hot wax into the mold, let it cool down, and then once it's cooled, you can pull it out, and that's, gives you a little candle like that beeswax here. So these aren't candle molds, but these are molds for pouring 1 pound and 1 ounce beeswax bars, and so I'll pass these around. These are made out of silicone, so these are constructed the same. They came from Man Lake as well, so they're constructed the same way that all their their candle molds are. So anyways, you can see they're quite pliable, so when you want to get your candle out, you can really, or your wax bars, you can really kind of get them out of the molds. So so that's a nice option, and it's the different forms of candles that they make molds for are pretty vast. There's a lot of different shapes and interesting things you can do there. And then you can make container candles. So any kind of glass jars or tin jars or things like that. You get a wick. You set the wick on the bottom and string it. You kind of have to have some way to anchor it in the center of the container. You can use anything like a popsicle stick or a bobby pin, or there's a lot, they sell specific devices for doing that, but really any low-tech solution you can get to work can work. So again, you just kind of set up a wick inside of your container like that. You pour hot wax in there, let it cool down, and you've got a beeswax candle. Wick choice is important to get good burning candles, so they make several different weaves of wick and diameters of wick, and so when you're deciding to make candles, it's good to kind of figure out what wick will be appropriate. I've made candles, I've made a bunch of large pillar candles out of the wrong type of wick, and the candles would bore rather than burn nice and evenly all the way to the edges. So I, was making I apparently used too small of a diameter of wick for the size candles that I was making. So just understand that there are variables with wicks. Before you start making candles, you're going to want to try and make sure that you get the right size wick for the candle that you have. So, and there's resources, there's entire candle making websites and supply stores. So there's a lot of info out there about wick choice. So cosmetics, beeswax is the primary component in lotions and lip balms. Lotion, we had a great talk in our club I think it might have been 2 years ago, by Jacqueline Soul, and she gave us a demonstration on how to make lotion with beeswax. And I'm not going to give exact ratios on this stuff. Again, online you can find out if you just look up beeswax lotion recipe or beeswax lip balm. There's a lot of resources out there, but basically most lotions have the lotion that we learned how to make has melted beeswax mixed with olive oil and some essential oils. Just the essential oils are just there to scent it, so you can kind of mix whatever essential oils to scent it however you want. But essentially the lotion is just comprised of beeswax and olive oil mixed together. And it's really cool because beeswax is yellow and olive oil is kind of yellow, and when you mix the two of them together, it turns into this like white substance. It's kind of a cool, and it's just kind of weird when it all comes together. But anyways, yeah. So kind of beeswax, olive oil, or a couple of other types of oils can be used, and then essential oils to scent is a way to make lotion. We've had a member make lip balm. I'm drawing a blank on who it is right now, but somebody has made lip balms that we sell at the fair and other events, and those have been a big hit. Those have been very popular. And again, basically melted beeswax mixed with some coconut oil or olive oil or almond oil, so coconut oil or almond oil, and then some vitamin E oil. And again, you can kind of use essential oils to your preference, but peppermint essential oil is a common one. And you can buy these empty chapstick tubes or lip balm tubes on Amazon or candle supply places, cosmetic supply places. So once you have your melted beeswax and your oil, you know, all this stuff mixed together, you basically just pour it into your little tubes, put the caps on, and you've got lip balms. So I think the first year we ever had these, there was someone came and bought a couple of them because they have a child with very sensitive skin that would react to a lot of stuff. They tried it with their kid didn't react to it, and they came back and literally bought out the entire supply that we had for the entire fair the first year that we did it because they were so happy with it. So if you know anyone with very sensitive skin that struggles to find products that their skin doesn't react to, making your own cosmetics can be really nice because you know what is going into it and you can leave out the things that your body reacts to and stuff. So this is a common thing for people with sensitive skin and for people that just want to know what's in the stuff they're putting on their body. So finishes and preserves for wood and other materials. So you can mix beeswax with mineral oil, linseed oil, or turpentine are all options. Again, there's plenty of recipes for this online, but you mix them together, you know, melt beeswax, mix in the oils, let it cool down, and then you've got a wood finish. I sell some of my beeswax to the San Javier farm, and they told me that one of the tribe members buys a lot of the wax that they get from me and uses it to preserve baskets that they make. So when they make woven baskets, they will then use the beeswax. I don't know the exact details of how they use it, but they're somehow coating their woven baskets with beeswax as a way to kind of preserve it and maybe give it a finish, I guess. So anyways, finishing, again, finishes or preservatives for wood. Historically, beeswax was used in shipbuilding and waterproofing of wooden ships. So, it was very historically important for a lot of sailors for many different things. So, beeswax is very good at protecting wood and is a good kind of natural solution depending on if you're have a cutting board or oftentimes cutting boards, beeswax is common rather than using some other unknown substance. And then last is plastic-free food wraps. So you can make food wraps that you can use in place of saran wrap or Ziploc baggies out of beeswax. Again, this is a way to just kind of reduce your plastic waste or not have plastic contacting your food and stuff. If that's something you're into. So basically, you take thin cotton cloth and coat it in. You basically drench it in beeswax and some pine resin and jojoba oil. There are several different formulations out there in the world for this, but the pine resin is used to make it a little more pliable. If you just use pure beeswax on one of these things, as you bend it and unbend it, you'll start to get cracks in your wraps, where if you put a little bit of pine resin in it, it just makes the wax a little bit more pliable, so you can bend it and fold it and use it many times without it cracking as much. And so you can look up kind of stuff for that, but again, you can use them as kind of cling wrap to wrap bowls up, or you can wrap sandwiches or breads or things like that. And kind of the cool thing is, because it's just thin cotton cloth, you can go to a supplier and buy any kind of cool pattern that you want to and make food wraps that are very unique and stylish, or have your own kind of flair to them. So these kind of emerged, I want to say maybe 5 to 8 years ago. I really started hearing about these, and they kind of became popular, and you can purchase them in stores, but it's, again, something that's pretty simple to make on your own if you want to do it. And then the other nice thing about them is they do kind of stick to things. So because with the beeswax and the warmth of your hands, you can kind of like stretch them over a bowl and press it to the bowl, and it will stick to it the way saran wrap does. So they actually really do and a pretty good job of replacing saran wrap if that's something you're interested in. They're reusable. You can just run them through this, rinse them off in the sink and reuse them. So anyways, plastic-free food wraps are another thing to do with your beeswax. So that's all I had planned. And I kind of discussed all the upcoming events. If you're interested in volunteering, please reach out to us. And then if you've got any questions related to the presentation or any stuff, feel free to ask. And thank you for listening as well.
wax cappings, what's that? Goodwill got me a big crock pot.
Yeah,
Just a small amount, one hive, whatever the heck, put it in that, set for a couple hours, come back, let it cool. Like you said, you got the layer wax, crud, and then honey.
and the honey blower, yeah.
Just plug in the wall
Yeah, and that's a good guide rather than buying a brand new stock pot. That's another thing I should have mentioned. Once you put wax into anything, you'll never get it perfectly clean again. So if you're gonna use a measuring cup for wax, you need a dedicated measuring cup. You can't pull the one out of your favorite measuring cup out of the drawer, use it for wax, and then expect it to ever to be the same again. So everything you do with wax can make a real mess if you melt it, in any pots or pans or cups you put it into are gonna be beeswax forever. So know that. So again, yeah, buying a stock pot at a Goodwill or a thrift store or something, is better than having to buy one new. So yeah, and I really, when the oven is nice for small batches, but once you get beyond just a little bit of wax, the stock pot is really a great solution. So yeah, that's a good point. And you didn't put any water in it; you just threw all your cappings in.
You set on the warm.
Okay.
And then it's gonna sit there all night because
Sure.
it's gonna take that.
It takes a while to melt.
You gotta watch out, like you said, that flash point or too hot.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, but if you leave it on low, you're not gonna get there, so. Well, that's cool, yeah, and then that way you still get a little melter honey out of that too, rather than having your melter honey ruined by the water, so.
Got a question for you. We use the melted honey. Can you feed that back to the bees?
So I actually have some questions about this myself, so no, the reason being, once you heat honey for a long time, heated honey produces a sugar called HMF. I don't know the long chemical name for it, but HMF is the chemical, and the longer honey is heated, the more HMF builds up in the honey, and HMF is toxic to bees or bad for bees. So theoretically, you don't want to feed heavily heated honey back to bees because that HMF, I don't know if you'll kill a hive outright, but you might make a hive sick by giving it heavy HMF honey. I have bunches of melter honey, and sometimes I make 750 gallons of syrup to feed to my bees, and I've wanted to ask, can I throw 5 gallons of melter honey in, with a whole bunch of other sugar, so it's not exclusively, sugar from melter honey, but I don't know where that cutoff for how much HMF is safe to give to bees and how much is considered too much. So I can't give you an exact number there, but traditionally people would say don't feed HMF heavy honey to bees. Yeah. So did you have I saw you react over there. What was that?
Well, don't feed
Melter honey.
burnt honey. The old time beekeepers in there, HMF stands for hydroxymethyl.
Okay.
It can be great for plastic additives and things like that once you isolate it. But I've tried. I've killed more bee hives than I would like to admit.
As any good beekeeper has.
Yeah. Yeah. So I really recommend staying away from burnt honey. And don't let bees come rob it out or something. Just treat it as something toxic. Or people who make meat who love the dark honey. You have somebody who wants to make wine and honey.
Yeah.
They fight over dark honey and burnt honey.
Yeah, it's typically meat, meat makers use a lot of honey and want a cheap source of honey, and so they'll buy up melter honey because you'll sell it, most people will sell it for significantly less than their table grade honey, and so, yeah, meat makers buy it up. It's kind of got a caramelized flavor to it, which I could see being good in barbecue sauces, so if you know anyone who's into making their own barbecue sauces, melter honey, I think would be a very good, similar to kind of a molasses type quality to it it's got. So anyways, yeah, that's some good uses for that. Yeah.
I mean, in Chinese traditional medicine and Ayurvedic medicine, they do also say that it's toxic for humans and should never be ingested.
The melter honey, okay.
Yeah, and I know a lot of people don't pay attention to that, but it's something that I find interesting that for thousands of years people have been like, no way, don't put that in your body.
Don't do that.
And since the bees don't do it either,
Yeah. So and I believe bees. It's not good for humans, but the amount that we can consume without having negative effects, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know the specifics on that stuff for sure. So yeah, it sounds like it's safer to just not do it. And I've never fed melter honey back to my bees, but I have so much of it that this is the first year I entertained the idea of doing it. So I'm not gonna do it. So, Any other question? That's a good, yeah.
So on the wax bees, do they spend their whole lifetime just making wax, or is there some portion of the lifetime they make wax and then go on to another activity?
Yeah, so, bees don't have jobs based on individuals, they have jobs based on how old they are. So yeah, so bees, mostly, it's not like one bee will be a forager its whole life and one bee will be a nest builder. They go through phases, they all start as nurses, and then they go from nurses to hive builders and defenders. So it's kind of as they're moving out of that nursing phase, before they become foragers, it's in that period that they make the wax, yeah. So the bees, as they age, their different glands in their body will like become stronger or weaker depending on what jobs they're doing. So very young bees have what are called hyperpharyngeal glands that are very well developed and strong, and that's what they use to make royal jelly, which is fed to the baby bees. So when you're a nurse bee, hyperpharyngeal glands are very important, and so they're developed, and then as a bee ages, just naturally, its hyperpharyngeal glands like shrivel up and don't develop. Its flight muscles develop more, and then its wax glands develop more as well. So there are kind of age-related developmental things that happen. So there are bees whose wax glands are right at that right point where they, are well developed and ready to produce. So yeah, that's kind of middle. Again, that's kind of why I said middle-aged bees. It's those transitioning from nurse to foragers that are said to be the hive defenders and hive constructors. So the ones that hang around the hive and do that. I don't know about. I know there's been some work done on precocious foraging. So when you take all the foragers away from a hive, take the entire foraging force away from a hive and leave it with only nurses. Some nurses will start foraging sooner than they would otherwise because they sense that the hive needs, that to be done. And then there's also reverted nursing, so bees that have turned into foragers, and then you take away all the nurses from a colony and you have a bunch of foragers that then have to revert back to nursing. So there's been a lot of studies on whether or not, are precocious foragers worse foragers because of their rush to forage early, are reverted foragers that are now nursing worse nurses, and in both cases I think yes is kind of the answer, but they've not done a lot of work on, I'm not aware of much research on the, trying to get bees to produce wax when they're foragers, or, essentially pushing bees to be wax producers out of their prime age foraging. So, but yeah.
Zoom.
That's a message for you.
Where's the question? Oh.
No, it's not a question, just a.
Susan,
Oh, comment. Thank you, Susan. Any other questions? Anyone got stuff going on with your bees? I don't know. Everyone's bees doing all right? Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm considering moving my bees from one location to another on my property. I currently have them in the back of my home, and I'm on about 4 acres, so they have, plenty of room. But I'm considering moving them to the front of my house, and it's not your typical front yard or whatever. I have probably about a 1/4 acre between the road and the front of my house.
Sure.
So my question, I guess, is do you think it would be too noisy, too disruptive to move them to the front? I just want to try to put them in a more shady area, and so I don't know if the benefits outweigh them.
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of a couple of ways to go about that. One would be to try and move them a little bit every day, and I don't know, depending on how your yard is set up, you may not be able to creep them from where they are to where they're going. One way to do that would be to put the hive on a wheeled cart and just move it a few feet every day. That's very obviously takes a while. The other option is you just take it one night, move it into its new location, and put a box in the old location. And so for probably a day or two, you're going to have a whole bunch of bees drift back to your old location in that old box. And in the evening, just take that old box, pick it up, carry it to where the new box is, and just shake all the bees out of it back into their new location. And hopefully after about 2 to 3 days of returning bees that are reverting to their old location, they'll get over it and stay in their new location. So, and I've moved hives a short distance and had them just figure it out on their own, where I didn't even have to, shake the bees over. So I'd say especially because you've got 4 acres and you know, creating a little bit of wayward bee traffic where the hive used to be is probably not that big of a problem. It's probably much easier for you to just move the hive at night, set up a catch box or a nuke or just anything that the bees will recognize as a hive and move into so that you can move them back, basically. So yeah, that's probably how I would go about it. And it shouldn't disrupt them too much. I move hives around my farm and frequently, and it doesn't, you know, as long as the queen doesn't get smashed because you're jostling things around, you know, frames are getting, you know, smacking into each other because you're jostling the hive sideways, you can smash a queen that way. But no, as long as you move the hive gently and don't drop it or jostle it too hard, yeah, it should be fine. So, yeah. All right, well, it's 11:10 p.m. Holy cow. Yeah, thank you all for coming out. I appreciate the great attendance, and yeah, hopefully we'll see you all at the pancake breakfast or one of the events we got coming up.
That's probably